No single force has changed American politics more than this little box. And the part of the change that's our subject in this broadcast is the television commercial. It's given us the 30-second president who speaks by the skill and with the images of the ad men and women who make the spots that urge us to buy this or that or do this or do that. The first person to join the medium and the candidate became one of the giants of American advertising. The same man who sold you this.
The administration has spent many billions of dollars for national defense. Yet today, we haven't enough tanks for the fighting in Korea.
Also sold you this.
Take Anacin for fast, fast, fast relief.
Now watch what happens when I use Rolade's miracle ingredient. All the acid here is taken care of.
M&M's milk chocolate melts in your mouth, not in your hand.
His name was Rosser Reeves.
The television hit after World War II. Everyone in the advertising business was absolutely terrified. No one knew how to handle it. No one had ever written advertising for television. No one knew what the techniques were, what the principles were. It was almost impossible to tell the difference between a good and a bad commercial. And it was a very exciting era, naturally, because we were discovering. I mean, we were all Christopher Columbuses, you see.
Rosser Reeves came to fame and fortune on Madison Avenue as the dean of the Hammer at Home School of Advertising. He had a talent for turning television into a merchandise mart and himself into a multimillionaire. As I learned in this interview shortly before his death, Rosser Reeves figured the television audience was, well, sort of an island waiting to be invaded.
We began to discover that with very small sums of money, we could register what we call penetration into the brains of 60, 70, 80% of all the people in the United States.
Fast, fast, fast relief.
Did that scare you?
Well, it frightened. We realized that we had a demon, you know, I mean, by the hands, you know, in our hands. It was a terrifying and exhilarating statistic to us.
Exhilarating?
Well, of course. I mean, we were in a competitive business. And who can do this best is the man that gets the business.
Let's take some of your most successful campaigns. Anacin.
Well, Anacin is a very famous headache remedy that's been around for many, many years. And the Anacin commercial was probably the most outstanding example of all time of real hard sell.
Oh, I remember it. I remember from my youth, you know, when headaches strike, what do doctors do?
What do doctors do when headache strikes?
Before you take anything for headache, stop. Ask yourself, what do doctors recommend?
What do doctors recommend for headache pain?
Here is your answer. 3 out of 4 doctors recommend the ingredients in Anacin. You see, doctors know when headache strikes, pain mounts up. You feel dull, depressed. Tension puts nerves on edge. Now, aspirin has only one pain reliever. Add buffering, you still get only one. But Anacin is like a doctor's prescription. That is a combination of ingredients to 1, relieve pain. 2, help overcome that depressed feeling. 3, calm jittery nerves.
When it ran, what happened?
Sales went through the roof.
Were you surprised?
Yes, I think I was, because you see, we were all new to television in those days, and we did not know what a thing we had, what a powerful medium that we were working with.
And that was evidence.
Oh, indeed it was. It was evident to us. We were in packaged goods, and we knew almost instantly when things were working, because we could see the goods move right off the shelves. And when we discovered the power of television, we just dropped everything else and went for TV.
You get fast relief from pain, fight depression, calm jittery nerves.
What's very interesting to me, another side of that coin, was the fact that it was perhaps the most hated commercial on the air at the time. The Prince of Hard Sell, they called me. People saw it over and over and over again. The hammers in the heads, the spark coil jumping. There was a commercial that almost induced the headache that it was supposed to cure. Very interesting point, though, in advertising, that what the public thinks is an unpopular commercial has no correlation at all with the sales.
How do you explain that?
I can't explain it. It's just that the commercial is an instrument to get people to remember your advertising.
Well, you did with this one, because even now I can I can see and hear.
Take Anacin for fast, fast, fast relief.
Those commercials haven't run in years, and you still remember them.
Oh, I do.
That's the name of the game.
You make it sound so simple.
Well, it is very simple, in my opinion. I think most advertising men, they get tangled in their own underwear. You know, you have to be terribly simplistic.
M&M's milk chocolate melts in your mouth, not in your hand.
You know how many illiterates we have in the United States? People that do not have the verbal skills, who can't read, people that speak other languages.
This Bic pen placed in a high-speed drill.
You have to take what the product has, reduce it to a few essentials that are meaningful to them,
That burning sensation.
put it in a memorable television commercial,
Bic doesn't clog.
and then spend the money. It's a very simple business.
I feel great.
All right, let's take one of your most famous products, Dwight Eisenhower.
Oh, you can hardly include him as packaged goods, can you?
Well, what was the philosophy behind the Eisenhower ads? How did you decide to package the general?
Well, I didn't try to package the general. I did not try to put any words in the general's mouth. But the general was a singularly inept speaker. I remember that he had made a big speech in Philadelphia. I went to Philadelphia and heard the speech, and I think he covered 27 different points. And the next morning, I had my research crew there, and I discovered that nobody knew what the general had said. He was all over the lot. And so we tried to find out what Eisenhower really stood for. You can't sell 27 things at all. So we selected 3. I wanted to select 1. The Republican National Committee wanted 3. And we picked those 3, corruption in Washington, the higher taxes, and so on and so forth. He was magnificent, did it all in one day, 44th Street at Transfilm Studios. We thought he would get through 4 commercials in the day, and he cut 35 or 40 in one day.
Did he memorize them?
We had some of the highest priced art directors in the world who were down on all fours lettering it on cards, and the general would read it once. He was a very fast study, and he played it perfectly.
Eisenhower answers America.
General, both parties talk about bringing down food prices. How do we know which party to believe?
Well, instead of asking what party will bring prices down, why not ask what party put prices up? Then vote for a change.
You know what things cost today. High prices are just driving me crazy.
Yes, my Mamie gets after me about the high cost of living. It's another reason why I say it's time for a change. Time to get back to an honest dollar and an honest dollar's worth.
Eisenhower answers America.
I'm a veteran, General. What's wrong down in Washington? Graft, scandal, headlines. How can you fix it?
Here's how. By your votes, we'll get rid of the people who are too small for their jobs, too big for their britches, too long in power.
And at the end, absolutely exhausted, we were going back to the Commodore Hotel to have a drink. He mopped his brow and says, "Think that an old soldier should come to this."
Didn't you record Eisenhower's answers and then bring in people to ask the questions after they'd been recorded?
Well, as the commercials were written, and the general recorded the answers before we found the people to ask the questions. Yes, that is quite correct.
Eisenhower answers America.
General, if war comes, is this country really ready?
It is not. The administration has spent many billions for national defense. Yet today, we haven't enough planes for the fighting in Korea. It's time for a change.
Where'd you get the people?
The people were picked up, we wanted people from all around the country, and they were taken from tours of Radio City.
Tours of Radio City?
That's correct.
You asked them, are you a farmer? Are you a housewife?
Are you a farmer? And are you interested in Eisenhower? What questions would you ask? And then we'd say, would you ask that question? It was photographed on a separate day, and I don't see any great harm in that, do you?
It was a new technique.
It was the first time that television had ever been used to try to help a president be elected.
Do you think it denigrated politics?
No. They were very simplistic commercials. They look almost naive in terms of modern television techniques.
And yet a great howl went up about merchandising the presidency.
Well, stop and think. Who remembers? If you remember Franklin Delano Roosevelt's inaugural address, people only remember one thing in it. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. There in the middle of an inaugural address was a 5-second spot, and that's all people remember. If you take all of Winston Churchill's great lines, you'll never have so many, owed so much to so few. Does anybody remember the speech in which that was embedded like a little fly in amber? It was a spot. It came out. It's what lingered in the minds of the hearers and in the press. So I simply decided that if that was what democracy is all about, why not tell more people? And I still defend the technique.
But they accused you of introducing the techniques of Madison Avenue into national politics.
It was inevitable that it had to happen. I was merely the first one that did it.
I for president, 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 I for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington.
In addition to an advertising budget 10 times bigger than the Democrats, Eisenhower had animation from the Disney studios and the music of Irving Berlin.
I like Ike, we are going to travel day and night for president. Let Adelaide go the other way, we'll all go with Ike.
Ike clinched the election with a last-minute promise to go to Korea, although he never explained what he would do when he got there.
We'll take Ike to Washington, we'll take Ike to Washington.
The Republicans were back in the White House for the first time in 20 years. Kennedy's most effective spot, one used over and over, simply quoted President Eisenhower, who was asked by a reporter to name one major idea of Richard Nixon's that Ike had adopted. Just one.
If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember, because...
Ike's off-the-cuff remark damaged Nixon, but the vice president hurt himself even more in what came to be known as the Great Debate.
Here are some revealing excerpts from the Great Debate.
Well, now, let's look at these bills that the vice president suggests were too extreme. One was a bill for $1.25 an hour for anyone...
Appearances were everything. Radio audiences thought Nixon had won the debate, but to TV audiences, he seemed nervous and uncomfortable. He had only recently been in the hospital recovering from an illness, and his refusal to wear makeup didn't help his appearance. Kennedy's ad men made the most of it. Spots featuring a shifty-eyed, scowling Nixon appeared right up to Election Day.
Americans want to move ahead with new leadership. Let's elect John F. Kennedy president.
And they did, by just over 100,000 votes.
I know what kind of a dream Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Harry S. Truman and John F. Kennedy would dream if they were here tonight.
Lyndon Johnson was the president in 1964, and his opponent did what challengers usually do. He ran against that mess in Washington.
Graft. Swindles. Juvenile delinquency. Hear what Barry Goldwater has to say about our lack of moral leadership.
We, as a nation, are not far from the kind of moral decay that has brought on the fall of other nations and people.
In a television campaign that relied on half-hour speeches, Barry Goldwater painted a civilization on the verge of collapse, morally bankrupt at home, and threatened by a creeping communist menace abroad. Goldwater called for action.
I want American kids to grow up as Americans, and they will, if we have the guts to make our intentions clear. So clear they don't need...
But the central issue of the campaign, exploited by the Democrats, soon became Barry Goldwater's own intentions.
In your heart, you know he's right.
Democratic spots portrayed Goldwater as too far to the right of mainstream America. Their ammunition had been handed them by a bitterly divided Republican Party.
I don't know just why they wanted to call this a confession. I certainly don't feel guilty about being a Republican.
Lyndon Johnson was asked if he shouldn't label Goldwater an extremist. No, said the president. Moderate Republicans had done that for him.
I voted for Dwight Eisenhower the first time I ever voted. I voted for Nixon the last time. But when we come to Senator Goldwater, now it seems to me we're up against a very different kind of a man.
Barry Goldwater said, "Sometimes I think this country would be better off if we could just saw off the eastern seaboard and let it float out to sea."
Even his running mate, William Miller, admits that Senator Goldwater's voluntary plan would destroy your Social Security.
But the president did want to remind voters that Senator Goldwater had talked loosely about tactical nuclear weapons. After Goldwater had cracked that maybe we ought to lob one into the men's room of the Kremlin, bumper stickers said, "In your heart, you know he might." This spot never even mentioned Goldwater by name, but proved to be one of the most controversial in the history of advertising.
7, 6, 6, 8, 9, 9.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
I'm Ronald Reagan. Every American should hear what Barry Goldwater really has to say, not what a bunch of distorters of the truth would have you believe.
The actor Ronald Reagan came riding to Barry Goldwater's defense in one of his first nationally televised speeches. But neither he nor other Republicans could save the Goldwater campaign.
Our opponents are referring to us as warmongers. Well, Barry, in my mind, this is actual Tommy rot.
Even the beloved Ike couldn't help. Johnson won by a landslide. 1964 was some year in the evolution of political advertising. I know because I was in the middle of it. Seems a long time ago now, 1964. I was a young man up from Texas, a son of the New Deal, working for someone, Lyndon Johnson, who himself, 20 years earlier, had said that FDR was like a second daddy to him. I was a special assistant at the White House, and one of my jobs that year was to be a liaison for the president to the people who had been hired to create the advertising for the campaign. That was the agency of Doyle Dane Bernbach. They were famous for the Volkswagen campaign. Remember that marvelous slogan, "Think Small." They also did the Avis campaign, "We Try Harder." They were departing from the hard sell strategy of Rosser Reeves. And one of the men to whom they turned, I never met him, by the way, until a year or so ago, was a brilliant young fellow named Tony Schwartz. He was among the first of a new class of players in presidential politics, the media specialist. It's a long way from the torchlight parade of the last century to Tony Schwartz.
Have you thought about the vice presidential candidates?
For 20 years, scores of politicians have made the pilgrimage to this windowless sanctuary of sound in Midtown Manhattan. Here, Tony Schwartz has created some of the most effective commercials for Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey, George McGovern, and Jimmy Carter, not to mention Coca-Cola and Alka-Seltzer. Tony Schwartz began his career as an artist, but in the 1950s he began to experiment with tape recorders and launched a new career that would establish him as the Wizard of Sound. In his commercials, Schwartz aims at the seat of emotion far within the subconscious. He doesn't like the label soft sell that has been used to describe his work. This is no soft sell, says Tony Schwartz. It's deep sell. The Daisy spot is perhaps the best example of Schwartz's emotional deep sell. It only aired once in that campaign, and yet it is still talked and written about all these years later. Now, what does that commercial do?
This commercial is really a Rorschach pattern. Reminds me very much of the person who will go to a psychologist and be shown the ink blots and say to the psychologist, "Doctor, I didn't come here to be shown dirty pictures." And
the dirty pictures being
in their mind. Now, the dirty thing or negative thing, if anything, was Goldwater wanting to use or seeing as an option the use of tactical atomic weapons. People didn't hear the word tactical. They just heard Goldwater atomic weapons, Johnson no atomic weapons.
Or didn't this commercial exploit the seeming simplicity of Goldwater's statement?
Yes.
I remember that when it aired, the White House switchboard was jammed with calls. Many of the president's own friends got through to him. He called me and said, "What in the expletive deleted is going on here?" I said, "It seemed to me that you did what you wanted to do, which was to remind people of what Barry Goldwater had been saying about atomic weapons." And there was a long pause on the phone, and he said, "Yeah, I guess you're right." Was it unfair?
I don't think so at all. I think it probably was right on target.
What did it do?
It made people aware of this basic difference, and it really showed the underlying fear that people had of atomic warfare. And I think Goldwater should have said the next morning that this commercial should be the theme of the presidential campaign, and I'd like to pay for half of its running. And that is, how do we prevent atomic warfare in our day and age? He could have killed that whole commercial that way, I think.
And he didn't.
And he didn't.
Instead, he
and
reacted.
It fit. His saying foul says it fits. That's me they're talking about. We didn't say it, he said it.
Rosser Reeves said of commercials, "We realized we had a demon on our hands." Do you agree with that?
I came into it when it was already here, so I didn't see it as a demon, but I feel that it's probably one of the most important things in changing our lives and restructuring our lives.
In what way?
I think that television has restructured the way we shop, the way we learn, the way we entertain ourselves. Just all the important things in our life have been restructured by television.
Has it restructured politics?
Absolutely. We find that the political parties are no longer the major communications force in politics. The networks are. You might say the three parties are ABC, NBC, and CBS.
What has it done, Tony, to the selling of presidents and political candidates?
I don't use, and I don't like the term selling the candidate. I don't use advertising techniques to, quote, sell candidates. Many people say you shouldn't sell candidates the way you sell soap.
Right.
I wouldn't even sell soap the way they sell soap. They try to throw things at the consumer. They use the consumer as a target. And I use the consumer or the voter as a workforce.
A workforce?
Yes. And that's the difference between TV commercials and print. They are emotional. You react to them. You hear and see things and react to them rather than go through the process of reading and thinking in a different ways. For instance, if I were to say to you, Mary had a little
lamb,
or for the rest of your
life.
Right. These are things that are stored in your mind from your experience in life, and I can evoke them with what I say. And that's where you become workforce in the process.
I become your workforce.
That's right. I use polling to find out what's in your mind in relation to the things we're going to talk about. We test before we do commercials. The advertising community likes to test their commercials. I find no value to it. We don't test the commercials, we test the public and see whether, after we've run the commercials, whether the attitudes they have changed. If they have, then the commercials are working.
Well, that newspaper clipping on your wall over there says, "Snaring votes means hitting emotions." That's what it is.
That's right.
And how do you decide how to hit those emotions?
Up on the wall there, you can see those records. I've been recording the people and life of New York for 40 years. So I've had experience of how people react. I even did an interesting thing. I performed in a nightclub for 5 or 6 years on Saturday nights, just playing tapes of people. And I found how people reacted to people. I would play children, I would play taxi drivers.
So what did you learn from this that you brought into politics?
I learned what people reacted to. I learned how people reacted to to hearing people and to sound.
This Tony Schwartz ad for Hubert Humphrey in 1968 used 30 separate instruments to create this noise, which he calls the sound of a headache. George McGovern decided not to use this 1972 spot that combined the eerie sound of jets with this wrenching image from television news. Like the Daisy commercial, the opponent's name is never mentioned. The only words were spoken by Schwartz's 5-year-old son.
Does a president know that planes bomb children?
People say, how can you educate the public about issues with commercials? The fascinating thing is that's not the function of commercials. You or our listeners have their opinion about all the issues. You know, if I were to say to you, do you have an opinion about the death penalty? You'd say yes or no. Sure. You have it one way. About abortion, about the economy, you have your position on that. The education that takes place in commercials is to find out what the candidate's position is. Does he feel the same way I do about these things? And that's what we tried to do. We tried to communicate the candidate's feelings about things that people feel deeply about. In an interesting way, we find that politics is probably the most task-oriented area of advertising that ever existed.
Task-oriented?
Yes. In product selling, you can go up 3% a year and be happy. You can lose 3% a year and be happy. But in politics, you have a one-day sale. You have if you put it in advertising terms, you have every customer allowed in the store for 1 or 2 minutes on that day, and you have to sell a majority or plurality of the market, or you are out of business.